The Insurance Brokers Podcast is brought to you by Sarah Myerscough of Boston Tullis.
Welcome to the Insurance Brokers Podcast with your host, Sarah Myerscough. This business podcast is for ambitious brokers determined to grow their business. Our guests are highly experienced industry experts and innovators. This is the place to leverage their success, learn how to break through barriers to growth, and discover a community of support and ideas whilst growing your business.
Good morning, Gary. I'm really excited to have you this morning on the Insurance Brokers Podcast. So welcome.
Sure.
So, semi-professional rugby player through to market leader in property insurance in South Africa. Please talk me through that story.
Semi-professional, that sounds awfully grand. I mean, I received a little bit of money in a brown envelope from time to time when I played rugby, particularly in South Africa. But certainly I started out with aspirations that rugby would come first, and I probably thought I was better than I really was. So I played at a reasonable level of rugby. When I came to the startling conclusion I wasn't quite good enough to make a full-time career out of it, I decided I should sit some insurance exams, which I did. And by then I'd worked roughly wherever I was playing rugby. So I'd worked originally around the Eastern Counties, then I was working in London, then I was working in South Africa. So that gave me the opportunity, because my companies were good enough to sponsor me whilst I was playing rugby and touring to various countries. Whilst they were good enough to sponsor me, I started to pick up my trade, I guess. And certainly by the time I was 28, 29, when I realised I wasn't really good enough to complete my first love, as it were, I started to take insurance seriously, and that's where I found myself. I think I was always keen and enthusiastic about the concept of starting my own business as well, and always in the back of my mind, I've always been impressed by various entrepreneurs in various industries, from various backgrounds, etc. And I think I was always destined one day to start my own businesses. But when I was in my 20s playing rugby, that business could very well have been something other than insurance, I guess, at that time.
How old were you when you started your first business, and what business was it?
The first business that I started with any real venom, I was 35, and I started a business with a friend of mine, Dave Manuel, a business called Emerald. We started that in South Africa, and we built that out into 2 or 3 other territories as well. But certainly I was 35 before I started to go my own way, as it were.
Do you remember the pivotal point at which you went, I'm going to start a business called Emerald?
Well, the name came from a green E that I'd seen on a computer drawing, and I really liked this green E, and I thought that should be our logo. I had no idea at the time that the green E was cut out of emerald stone, so it was the logo that came first, in actual fact. In terms of the business, I think it's fair to say that Dave, who was my mentor really, he was the one that kept saying to me, we should do this, we should do this, we should create our own MGA, we should look to create our own capital, we should set up our own cell captives, we should buy our own reinsurance. And I think it's fair to say, I know it's fair to say that Dave was very much the instigator of that. And because I liked the sound of it, and because it gave me the opportunity to run my own business, and not without a certain amount of ego, I suspect, I thought, that's a great idea, let's do it.
Emerald has been hugely successful, and you are about to embark on Sapphire, or are already in the process of, which is incredibly exciting. What lessons did you learn in the early days that you're mindful of now as you're going through the process of Sapphire?
I think in the early days of Emerald, we had such a lot of fun, and we kept we made our own rule book. We made loads of mistakes along the way, I suspect. Well, I know we made a load of mistakes along the way. I think we had enormous fun. And my partners at the time, Dave was a lot older than me. The other partner involved at the time was a company called Supergroup. Because Supergroup and Dave were ready to sell, I was dragged along in that process because as a 30% shareholder, I certainly couldn't stop the sale going through. And I supported the sale at the time. But Dave and Supergroup were at different ends of their lifespan, if you like, with regards to the insurance setup. So certainly with Sapphire, I am the dominant shareholder in the UK company, one of the South African companies. The trading company in South Africa at the moment, I'm a 49% shareholder, but my partner out there is an established South African insurance company called Bright. So the very setup with Sapphire is slightly different from Emerald, and I've certainly got a different end in mind. I think naively, when we set up Emerald, we didn't know where the journey was going to take us. And after several years, when the opportunity came along to sell it, we all got quite excited. And I understand a lot of the M&A activity going on at the moment around the industry. A lot of this is based on emotion and excitement, because everybody likes to see. We complain about change in many times in our lives, but the idea of change in ownership in something that you're involved with is quite an exciting process. And I certainly have enjoyed buying and selling companies over the years, so I understand that. But with Sapphire, I certainly want to be around for the long game. I want Sapphire to be independent for as long as possible.
I think what you've said there about emotional decision is really interesting. I've done quite a lot of reading over the years, and something that comes out really strongly is we all make decisions on emotion and we justify with logic, but maybe don't acknowledge that it's an emotional decision. And I'm terrible at making emotional decisions, but I hold my hands up and say I want it and I don't care. Whereas my business partner is the logical one of us that goes, hang on a minute, let's think about that. So I do think you need that dynamic in a different sort of, in business and in life, I suppose, in different people and different personalities. One of the things that that I've read recently is a book that does case studies. It's gone through 7 or 8 different case studies on startup MGAs and startup carriers in the US, and their journey from sort of identifying the gap in the market through to the insurance solution that they've put forward. And one of the strong points that came out of that was how you have to have your team at the top has to be, there's no gaps in that team at the top in terms of a bit of capability, interest, drivers. You've got the big ideas, and then you've got the process orientated people. How have you, what bumps have you had along the roads in that respect, and how are you managing that with Sapphire? Because you've got lots of different partners involved, haven't you?
Yeah. So first of all, it is about the people. You need the right skill sets involved. With Sapphire, we're spending a lot more time and energy than I ever have done in my life with the technology backing up the business. But even still, you really require the strong people to distribute our products. There's no question about that. And we can't get past our personalities being the most important part of the Sapphire setup, in my view. You can borrow or use capital from different places. You can use different technology. You can decide on a different product range and a different geography, but you still need the professional output. And in fact, I would say one of the biggest hurdles I have currently with Sapphire is that there are several people who will be joining us during the next 18 months. And it's during the next 18 months, mainly because they're going to be sitting in the garden because they're on contracts and restraints with their current people. But I'm willing to wait for the right people. So what it means is at the moment, there's a lot of pressure on 2 people in the UK. There's a lot of pressure on 9 people in South Africa at the moment. There's a lot of pressure on the technology requirements that we're pushing through. So we're having to ride that out a little bit because it's more important to me that I get the right people and wait for some of those people a little longer. we need to have the full gambit. What's happening with the MGAs in the US is quite interesting as well, because if you follow recent press, some of them are suggesting now that there's going to be their own security rating for MGAs. So just as insurance companies have their own ratings, MGAs might be going that route. The reason that interests me is a lot of our future will be based around our own cell captives. And our own cell captives themselves will probably be only as good or as successful as their security allows us to. So the whole movement of MGAs within the industry towards a more formalised capital solution, I think is a really, really good one. And that's something I never anticipated until we started Sapphire a couple of years ago.
You mentioned that's a movement starting in the US. Are there inklings of that in the UK?
I've got no doubt there are. I mean, certainly the formalised structure in the UK, certainly the MGA Association has teeth now. Certainly it's been more well respected. There was mention in the press this week of one MGA group looking at acquiring a large organisation. So there's a lot more acceptance about how MGAs are moving forward. I think it's fair to say that when I started in the MGA world 20 years ago, MGAs were certainly perceived as the poor relation in the insurance setup. That's changed a significant amount. And the large broking houses right now, part of their growth is around their own in-house MGAs. So in the UK, it's certainly there are massive steps going forward. There's talks going on with the Lloyd's environment now. The use of syndicate in a box. There's another alternative capital stream. I think it's fair to say that the MGA footprint as we see it now will be very different in 2 or 3 years' time.
I think I'd love you to read the book I've just read, and then I'd love to have a conversation about it, because I think you'll have some really interesting views. The book is The Future of Insurance, written by Brian Falchuk, and he seems to be talking about it in all my podcasts at the moment, so people that listen will be like, bloody hell, Sarah, we don't even need to read the book now. I interviewed Brian about his book a week or so ago, and one of the themes that came out of his book was a lot of the US startups that he looked at started off as an MGA and realised that they were so restricted by their carriers that actually they've gone on and moved into the carrier space.
Yeah.
I think that what you're doing with Sapphire is a bit different. Will you talk us through the business structure of Sapphire?
Yeah. So when I effectively ran 2 other MGA groups after I sold Emerald, and one of them gave me the opportunity to run 17 separate binders across the globe. And I don't know why it took me so long to come to this natural conclusion, because everyone else probably got there a lot earlier than I did. But certainly there was a lot of duplication of costs. When you run a load of binders in a load of different geographies across a load of different products, in my opinion, you shouldn't have capital from 17 different sources. You shouldn't have 17 sorts of technology. You don't need quite so many finance environments. There's a lot of common threads to an MGA, from the US to Mauritius to Australia to France to Eastern Europe. And in fact, the very core of the strategy of Sapphire, again, I don't claim this is unique. I really, really don't. But at the core of the strategy is that if I find an underwriter that the reinsurance market will support, and that underwriter writes a product, and that product could be energy insurance, or it could be pet insurance, and he could be in Australia, or he could be in Kazakhstan. It doesn't really matter. The fact is that he's got capital support behind him, and he's got distribution, because presumably in his particular territory, the brokers know him or her. If I can find that individual, I want them housed within Sapphire. At the same time, what I'm saying to carriers and I'm talking about local insurance licenses, and I'm talking about the reinsurers. What I'm saying to them is, if you're going to back my lady in Kazakhstan or my guy in Australia writing whatever kinds of insurance it might be, A&H would be another good example, whatever it might be, why don't you follow us across the piece? And certainly when we started Sapphire, one of my first trips was to Baden-Baden, which carries the annual reinsurance conference. It's run pre-COVID. It was run every October. We'll see what happens this year. And I gave that story over because I didn't want to be limited to one territory. So at the moment, the first product we got off the ground is corporate property in South Africa. But certainly we're going to be involved in other products in other geographies as well. And I want the guys that have given me the chance to write on their insurance licenses and have given me access to their reinsurance capital, and who hopefully will be willing to support my own Sapphire cell captive in the future. I want a degree of commonality into the overall picture. And the overall picture is the individual is the underwriter in that particular territory with a product, but behind that individual, the Sapphire technology infrastructure and the Sapphire reinsurance piece will hopefully support in a cost-effective and an efficient manner their opportunities to write business.
That's incredible. And I think one of the things that I've learned is about finding the gap, or the different way of thinking, or solving a problem. And I think it's really interesting what you've done, because there is a massive amount of friction in the insurance market generally. And I suspect that's not limited to the UK. And listening to Brian, I can see it's there in the US. So to know that it's in Kazakhstan and Australia doesn't surprise me. So I think it's a really interesting solution to an interesting problem and an age-old problem, really.
Yeah, just to be clear, I don't know anyone in Kazakhstan. So if there's anyone listening to this from Kazakhstan that does insurance or A&H, I'm all ears.
Do you know, we actually have a global reach for the Insurance Brokers podcast. I'm always surprised when I look at the stats about where people are listening from. Okay. So anyone in Kazakhstan, get in touch with Gary. He'd love to hear from you. Right. What about straying slightly from what it is you're doing? You've obviously got a great network and a global network. There's all this talk about hardening market, there's talk about the global economic crash, and there has been what do you see happening? What do you think the next 5 years looks like from an global economy standpoint?
So I certainly wouldn't claim to be an economist, but what I would say is the fortunes of reinsurance capital, insurance capital are directly affected by it. Certainly when you had global event, and a global event could be localized like 9/11 was, or localized like Katrina was back in 2006, they had knock-on effects to reinsurance rates globally. Because fundamentally at the time, a big event in the United States did affect the reinsurance footprint in other territories, because they were looking to change their aggregation models, and they were looking to make up for some of the losses they'd had elsewhere. The COVID losses, and I'm not going to comment on where they're going to end up being, but one thing for sure, they will cost a number of capital providers a lot of money somewhere. I saw a press release last week that Willis Re was suggesting that the market was moving back towards equilibrium. I have no idea if that's true yet. In my world, I'll know more about that at the end of the year when I go and get my own reinsurance protections in place. But certainly last year, just about everyone I've met paid significantly more for their reinsurance, and those costs have to be passed down somewhere, and they usually pass back to the policyholder. I personally think that's going to happen for another year or so. I personally think that we need to create some payback for an extra year or so, but I could be wrong, and market forces will certainly change that. Again, what insurance companies around the world will be looking at right now is at what level they're buying their protections. So to save money, they might take more risk themselves. If the knock-on of that effect of that is after a really bad year, they have bigger losses, I'm afraid that still means the rates are going to harden. I think it's too early to say. I couldn't give you with any accuracy about the 5-year period, but I will say that the capital movements would follow the economic movements and probably take another year or two to get to what's been described as equilibrium.
I think that's interesting. Just something that's popped into my head from what you just said, slightly left of centre, but hey ho. One of the things that I'm quite intrigued about, and I'd like to learn more about, so if anybody listening wants to talk to me about it, then please get in touch. So one of the things that I'm interested in is startups, the insurance model in the US. There is an obscene amount of venture capital going into the market. And listening to some of these case studies, there's 3, 4, 5 funding rounds that go through before the company's even trading. And the model is massive. You're talking millions and millions. I know there's a lot of PE money in the UK, but it seems to be being distributed differently in terms of, you don't hear of 5 funding rounds of millions before something's actually live and going out in the same way that you are in the US. What do you think? How do you think that's going to affect? Do you think we're going to follow the US? What do you think about that?
So there's a lot of M&A press at the moment around. So we're looking now with interest, aren't we, on what might happen with the Aon Willis thing out the US, because they've got different hurdles to cross. Certainly back in South Africa, they've dealt with that particular merger in a slightly different way. So each territory has its own approaches to M&A, and each territory has its own processes around raising income. Certainly, I wouldn't suggest that I'm an expert in raising the kind of finance that's being publicised at the moment. One organisation is looking to refinance its own debt using a few $100 million. They're amazing sums that have been discussed. I think for as long as people see a return in the insurance and reinsurance field, there will always be money available. I think there will always be venture capitalists, there will always be individual investors that think there's a way to make money better in the insurance environment. And the M&A cycle, I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to continue. And in many ways, that makes it exciting. I have to say, in the broking world, I think personally it's a shame when you see fewer brokers. For me, that's fewer customers. For the policyholders, that might be less choice. So at the broking level, I think it's a shame. I would say at a capital level, it's probably inevitable, insofar as to achieve real economies of scale, when you're talking about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, certainly the economies of scale achieved in the capital world, I can absolutely buy into.
I think it's really interesting. I think the next 5 years are going to be really interesting. One of the things that I did a podcast, the first podcast I ever did actually, well over a year ago now, was with Peter Cullen, and he said he thinks the next 20, 30 years, the big players in the insurance global market will be Amazon and Google, and following on from that, InsurTech and insurers, legacy carriers, whatever you want to call them. There won't be a distinction between, there won't be that distinction anymore. Will be just insurance, and it'll be very tech based. And the amount of money that's coming into that now is in the billions, which astounds me. It's so interesting.
So I'm convinced that in the world of homogenous insurance products, so motor insurance would be the best example of that, I would think, but also household insurance, small commercial insurance. I can see why the various aggregator models are leaning more and more heavily on technology, and I can certainly, again, all the time you're seeing people investing in various systems and various ways of distributing a product. And I can see the arguments around Amazon and Google on those homogenous products. MGAs tend, not all of them, MGAs tend to look at what is euphemistically described as specialist business. That's probably a bit pompous, but certainly if I take corporate property insurance in South Africa, for example, I think there's only 400 or 500 clients. So modeling something around 400 or 500 clients, it doesn't matter, in my view, how good you are as an actuary, what IT system you've got to back you up. I don't think you're going to model those 400 or 500 clients successfully. So there you need professional help and expertise, in my opinion, to underwrite those 400 or 500 products particularly well. And I'm not sure what the magic number is, but certainly I would think you could argue the same about energy insurance in the US. You could argue the same about casualty insurance in many different geographies. I think specialist business, MGA related business, the business where reinsurers have more confidence backing one person as opposed to another. And that's what we see. And when we go to Baden-Baden, you will see a big German reinsurance company will have a discussion with 2 or 3 people writing the same products, and they will have a different idea and a different approach and a different rating structure for one person's reinsurance over another, because they believe their specialist skills in professional indemnity insurance for dentists is better than the next person. So I believe that approach is absolutely right with homogenous business. I'm probably bound to say this because of what I represent, but I don't think that's going to be the case in the MGA world for a while yet, anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the sort of complexity and the requirement for real professional expertise, but I also think there might be a space for I think you're doing it by taking the friction out using process and technology. That's where I see InsurTech InsurTech is used in so many different ways for so many different things, but identifying a gap and then using technology, AI, data to minimize friction and make the ultimate journey better. And that's what the way I see everything going, which I think is going to be very interesting. And you're doing it, so I'm really intrigued to sort of come along that journey with you and learn, because I think it's going to be a really, really interesting one. I think I think what you're doing is fabulous, and what I'd love to hear from you, please, what's your biggest blooper? What is over your career, your hugely successful career? What's your biggest oh no moment where you get in the shower and you go, oh, really, did that happen?
I'll give you 2 with the same reason. One, at Emerald, we opened up in Australia. And secondly, at Emerald, we opened up a loss adjusting environment. Both were good ideas, by the way. The concept of, and I would get involved with loss adjusting and Australia again. Nothing wrong with that. And so great ideas. The loss adjusting was going to support our corporate property outlook in South Africa. Our Australian strategy was to support all the various mining managers that were moving from South Africa to Australia. Great ideas, nothing wrong with the ideas, but the implementation, and I was responsible for it, no one else. The implementation taught me a lesson, and I think the biggest lesson was that we tried to grow too quickly, and I wasn't focused on what I was doing at the time. So I was building out our corporate property offering in Africa, and I allowed myself to be distracted. And 2 things happened. I mean, in Australia and the loss adjusting environments, I didn't give them the support they needed, but it also affected what I was doing in Africa with our own piece. And I would say for about 18 months, I had my eye my eyes everywhere, and they weren't focused on one particular thing. So with Sapphire, we've started in South Africa, and it's received all of my attention up until the time that my next 2 or 3 people join me. That will be absolutely the case. But we'd like to build out our offering. We'd like to be involved in other products. We'd like to be involved in other investments, but one step at a time. Now is probably the way I would look at it, until I have the resource around me. The biggest mistake I would say any MGA environment would have would be not to focus on one particular goal, or rather they must focus on one particular goal.
I don't think that's an MGA specific business problem. It's a business problem that I grapple with daily.
It probably goes back to ego as well, and I just thought I could do all these things so much quicker, and I tend to get impatient when things don't move at the speed that I expect. So the lesson was a personal one, but I can tell you it cost us some money as well, which probably made it a very expensive lesson.
Those are the lessons that you learn quickly from, though, aren't they? So I was telling you earlier, I'm just writing my personal statement for an award that I've been nominated for, and you have to write about personal challenges, etc., etc. Biggest thing for me for the last 2 years is me learning about me. And I have a tendency to run before I can walk. I have a tendency to want everything yesterday, and I'm responsible, so I'm going to go and do it. And I always take it on the chin. I take the responsibility and the work, but I really need to rein myself in on the focus. So that's another reminder, Gary. Thank you very much. Okay. One last thing. Who do you want to speak to? Who in the listeners of the Insurance Brokers podcast is it that you think a conversation would be of interest with?
So, in terms of focus, if you like, I would be very interested to talk to any underwriters out there that had a desire to have more say in their own futures. So, in terms of the growth of Sapphire, there will be underwriters out there that currently work for organisations, and I'm hoping they're the kind of underwriters that would be backed already by capital in other places. So if there is an underwriter and is involved in Kazakhstan, dentist's PI, or any geography or any product, and they think that they will get backing from capital, and the capital could be Lloyd's-based capital, it could be reinsurance treaty-based capital, or an insurance license in a location. They're the sort of people I would love to talk to and see if I can help them with some aspirations and future thoughts.
Fabulous. You've heard it here. Go speak to Gary if you are based in Kazakhstan. Gary, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation this morning, so thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you have enjoyed what you have heard, have any questions or feedback, please leave us a review and we will be sure to get back to you. If you would like further information on how Boston Tullis Group can support your business, or if you would like to join us on an episode, please do not hesitate to contact us.